Apple just released brand new MacBooks powered by new M1 chips. I bought this MacBook Air 8.5 years ago, and I really need an upgrade. So which one should I buy? And more importantly, which MacBook is right for you? Let's break it down. The MacBook Pro just got its biggest upgrade in years. There are two new sizes, a 14-inch and a 16-inch model, as well as two new processors, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. These new laptops come fresh off the back of last year's M1-powered MacBook Air, Pro and Mini, which were the first Macs to use Apple's new silicon rather than chips made by Intel. M1 is what's known as a system on a chip, or an SoC. That means components like the CPU, GPU and RAM are all unified together into the one chip. That gives Apple more control over how these machines run, and in practice, like we saw with last year's Macs, it meant faster processing, better performance and better battery life. Now, with the M1 Pro and M1 Max, Apple is promising even more.
M1 Pro is up to 2.5 times faster than the prior 16-inch model with the fastest GPU. And M1 Max is up to 4 times faster. This boost is dramatic for graphics-intensive tasks like rendering scenes in Cinema 4D. And when it comes to machine learning, you'll get up to 5 times faster performance.
When it comes to upgrading and choosing the right laptop for you, then more chips means more choices. And if I've learnt anything from the Cheesecake Factory menu, more choices can just lead to more questions. Do you want the original M1? Do you want M1 Pro? Do you want M1 Max? I was starting to feel very overwhelmed. Then I remembered that I work at CNET and I should just ask my colleagues for buying advice. Hey, clever idea. So I asked my friend Dan Ackerman. Dan is our pro on all things Mac, and I trust that he's going to help me find my way through this. So here are the main questions that I need to know the answers to. Do I buy this year's version of the MacBook, or am I okay with going with last year's? If I do buy this year's version, do I want the M1 Pro or the M1 Max? And the most important question, which kind of MacBook is right for which kind of buyer, and which one is right for you? Oh, and of course I need to ask him about that notch, but I'll get to that. I trust that Dan is going to be able to help me out with all of this, and thanks to the power of the internet, I have him right here to answer my questions. Hey Dan.
Hey there.
Now, you've been playing around with the MacBooks. Tell me, what are your first impressions?
Well, here's the first thing to know about it. I'm actually talking to you right now on the 1080, the high definition webcam built into the new MacBook Pro. I would normally never do that. The webcams in MacBooks and frankly, most laptops are very low res. They're not good. I would never dare to join a web meeting from a regular MacBook webcam because it just looks terrible. This at least looks pretty decent. And for a lot of people, that's a pretty big upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking pretty good to me from where I'm sitting. I want to know, the thing I'm most interested about is actual processing power and grunt in these new M1 Macs, because that's the whole selling point of this second generation of that M1 chip, right?
So here you have two new versions of the chip, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. The Max is the top, the Pro is in the middle, and the regular M1 is at the bottom. And in the 14 and 16-inch new MacBook Pros, you could get either one, the Pro or the Max. The real difference between them is the number of graphics processing cores. Other than that, they're also very similar to each other.
Okay, so tell me, when you've been testing around and playing with them, what are the main differences between the Max and the Pro? How are they kind of handling different tasks?
Right now, in my initial testing, and what we do at CNET is very mainstream focused, I have not seen a ton of daylight between the two, but I have seen a huge amount of difference between this M1 Pro and the M1 Max and the regular M1 and even older Core i7 Apple systems or Windows systems. I put together some 8K footage in Premiere and threw a bunch of color corrections on it and some motion graphics and titles, and just kind of gummed it up a bit to just make it kind of difficult to export. And that clip, which was only like 45 seconds long, took about 22 minutes to export on a M1 MacBook Pro, the 13-inch from last year. Took about 20-something minutes on an older Core i7, I think 27-inch iMac from 2019. And it took 10 minutes on both the M1 Pro 14-inch I have and the M1 Max 16-inch I have. That's less than half the time. With the new ones, they're more expensive, $19.99, $24.99 to start. And then obviously you go up from there. your CPU choice, the RAM, the storage, all adds to the price. You can get, up to $6,000 pretty easily by maxing them out, but they're really for that pro audience. And hopefully your employer or your company is buying that for you. Or if you're a high-end freelancer, you have a business reason for getting it. If you're not one of those people and you just want the latest and greatest MacBook, because the screen is nicer, the screen bezel is narrower, the camera is better, all that. The design is got all the new ports on it, or all the old ports back again. But if you're not in the industry, just be aware you're essentially making a vanity purchase, and that's okay. But you don't really need it.
Vanity purchase is a good way of putting it. I kind of like that. All right, now, I used to be just into word processing, used to just do basic internet stuff on my computer. Now I'm editing my own videos, I'm editing audio, and so I feel like my old MacBook Air just isn't cutting it anymore. My first question is, last year's M1 or this year's M1s? Out of those two, what would you choose?
Now, if you are mostly working in 4K video or FHD, 1080 video, and you're just doing basic editing, I don't necessarily think you need one of the new M1 Pro or M1 Max systems. I mean, I've been doing that stuff all year on a MacBook Air with the M1, and that's fine. Your MacBook Air that you want to replace, first, I would find out from you what year it was and what the chip in that was. If it's a 2019 or 2018, you're not going to see a big jump going to the M1 Air. But if it's older than that, you certainly might. So I think you're looking at the $999 Air, although you'd probably, throw some storage and RAM upgrades in that, or the $1999 14-inch, which I will say is, frankly, significantly thicker and heavier than the 13-inch Pro it's replacing. It's about a half pound heavier, which ain't peanuts when it comes to laptops. It's only a little bit thicker.
So say I choose this year's N1 chips. Obviously, you said that the 14 or 16-inch, you can kind of put each processor inside. So should I be looking at M1 Pro or M1 Max? And of course, on the site, you can kind of choose the number of cores in your processor. So I guess talk me through cores and talk me through Pro versus Max.
In the Pro, I think you could start off with 8. They define, it's different than how it used to be, where you had your CPU, and in Max you had a discrete AMD GPU option. Just like in a PC, you can get your Intel or AMD GPU, and you can get an AMD or an NVIDIA graphics card, or various other parts. They divide this up into, on the M1 chip, there's a certain number of cores dedicated to CPU processes and a certain number dedicated to graphics processes, and I think you can do 8 or 10 for the CPU part of it on the Pro. I would just do the one step up and get the 10. They put an oddly slightly underpowered one in that base model there, and you could do, I think, 14 or 16 GPU cores on the Pro. You can do 24 or 32 on the Max. I think for regular video editing, the kind of stuff that I know that you do, if you wanted to step up, I would just get the standard M1 Pro with the 10/16. That seems to be a good middle ground. It's not the lowest N1 they have, which seems to be there just to hit a particular price point. That seems to be the mainstream choice. I think you have to be pretty advanced in what you're doing to really need that M1 Max and the 32 graphics cores. But again, it's very early days for that stuff.
And that's, I guess, one of my next questions. Who should really be going for that Max? What kind of group?
There's a lot of people who work with very complex 3D models. They could be doing graphics stuff for movies or games, or they could be doing engineering projects, or they could be working on video projects that are just incredibly complicated, because so many of it's all plug-in, driven now, and a lot of that is so CPU and sometimes GPU intensive. So if you're the kind of person who has a Mac Pro desktop, or would get one, or would get the totally maxed out 27-inch iMac with the highest range AMD card that they used to offer, then maybe you're in that category. But even at this early point, I haven't found a ton of daylight between the two, but I don't think the workloads I'm putting into them are intense enough.
That's a very good point. I think the people that are going to be after that really, really high-end machine probably already know who they are.
If you have to ask, then it's probably not you.
That is a very good point. Dan, I am so sick of using a million dongles for my MacBook. I was very excited about seeing all the ports. What's your read on the bringing back of all these ports?
God, it's so interesting because, right, they brought back the HDMI port, the SD card slot, even MagSafe, the connection, which, is very handy for clumsy people like myself. But I also like that everybody was using USB-C to charge their laptops and their phones and their Nintendo Switches, and you could just swap the cables back and forth all the time. You could still charge the new MacBooks with USB-C, but they come with the MagSafe cable. So if somebody goes, hey, does somebody have a MacBook cable I can borrow, and you have your MagSafe cable, it's not going to be very helpful to them. I think that cuts down on the interoperability of cables. That's just nobody agrees with me, but I feel strongly about this. For the other stuff, it's a little bit like, and I never thought I would see this happen, Apple went back to everybody's wish list and just took kind of a greatest hits approach to putting ports in there. Do we need USB-A? Probably not. But do we need HDMI? Yeah, people will like that. SD card. I don't use SD cards that much, but a lot of people do. Let's bring that back. So I feel like they kind of gave in and gave the people what they wanted. And it feels a little bit retro, but also, forward looking at the same time, because you're right. You can't use USB-C for everything. I find people use dongles and adapters a lot less than they think they will, because almost everything you can airdrop it or email it or Slack it, or there's not that much stuff you're plugging in these days, unless maybe you're transferring a lot of big footage files around like you might be.
One of the things I noticed when I was looking through the different Mac options was memory. Now, I kind of, in my rudimentary understanding of laptop buying, I know that memory is the thing I really need to be looking for, but most of these models have just got that kind of 16 gig, and only the really, really tippy top model jumps up to 32. Is this because the processors themselves are better able to handle tasks? Or it seems crazy to me that that's not something that you can kind of jump up on.
That's true. I think if you want to get the 32 gig RAM option, you have to go with the M1 Max. 16 is fine for most people. I think the Air's default to 8 now. It used to be 4. I think it's 8 now. Frankly, that's fine. I think on Windows laptops, you see a lot more variation, where you could get a really cheap laptop that just has 4, or if you spend $1,000 or so, then you're going to get 16, or sometimes a little bit more in a gaming laptop or something 32. Frankly, I think the 16 is fine for most people, but I wouldn't really go less than that.
So physical design, 14-inch or 16-inch, I know I like the portability, but tell me what your thoughts are about losing the touch bar, and talk me through that notch on the screen.
Oh, that touch bar. No one will go on record defending the touch bar. I will not go on record defending the touch bar either, but I will say I liked riding the fader on the brightness and the volume. And within some apps that had touch bar support, you could really have an actual fader or jog wheel on there. And that was okay. I'm not mourning the loss of the touch bar. And frankly, the best part of it has already been broken out. That's the fingerprint reader. I think the notch on the screen, obviously it's very much like the iPhone notch. They've moved the menu bar for whatever app you're in up to the top of the screen, where the notch kind of sits in the middle of that menu bar. So it's mostly hidden from sight. If you're going full screen on something, it usually does kind of like a little half letterbox full bar across the top. Some people won't like it. Some people complain about it. Some people still complain about the notch on the iPhone or other phones. Frankly, you get used to it pretty quickly.
So as much as I love just asking my colleagues for personal buying advice, I am thinking about the people who are going to be watching this video. What's your kind of general lay of the land when you look at the Mac landscape now with the new M1 chips for someone who's upgrading their MacBook or potentially coming over for the first time? What's your kind of TLDR basic buying advice?
I always say, and I think this continues to be true, that $999 MacBook Air is probably the most universally useful laptop you can buy. They last for a long time. They're built like tanks. It's a really good user experience. And frankly, they're a really good price. You can usually get $100 off during the holiday season or with a student discount. So really nice. I think for most people, that's frankly the first place you should look. And I've done plenty of video editing on a regular M1 MacBook Air, even 4K stuff. And it's fine. I use Photoshop and Illustrator on there all the time, and play games on there, whatever, the handful of games that you can play on a Mac. If you're in that professional audience, then you probably know what you're looking for, and you've been waiting for these, and these are here now. The 16, people feel like it's a replacement for that magical 17-inch MacBook Pro that people still talk about, even though it was actually discontinued back in 2012. And that's, it's a desktop replacement. It's a big, heavy system. The 14-inch is more compact, but it's still not small like the Air or even the old Pro was. So just be aware, it's going to be a little heavier than you think it is. And at $2,000 to start with, it's certainly not cheap like the Air is. But again, if you're in that business and you know that is what you need, and better if somebody else is paying for it, well, then obviously that's the direction you want to go in.
Thank you so much for giving me all this advice. I feel like you've helped me a lot. You've definitely helped a lot of people watching this. So thanks, Dan, and I look forward to reading more as you play around more with these computers.
Awesome. Good talking to you.
All right, well, there you have it. All of the info you hopefully need to help you choose which MacBook is right for you. As for me, I think I probably need to check my bank account. I love the idea of $1,000 giving me a machine that basically does everything I need, but I kind of want to future-proof it, so maybe I want to go with $2,500 for the new M1 Pro. I think that's just going to be a budgetary decision that I'm going to have to make over the next couple of days. But let me know what you think. Which one are you going to upgrade to? Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're there, make sure you like and subscribe. I'll also share details on where you can find Dan's MacBook review, and of course, if you're interested in picking up one of these devices, I can give you some info on where to find them. Cheers, guys.